Welcome to Thinking Bedtime, where philosophy and psychology are told slowly and gently. Each video offers a profound perspective, shedding light on philosophical and psychological ideas from cultures around the world. Thank you for listening. If you find the content helpful, please like, share, and subscribe so Thinking Bedtime can continue to be with you. Today, Thinking Bedtime is pleased to present to you the philosophy of the afterlife.
Death has long been a crossroads between philosophical concerns and the deepest anxieties of human life. The question of the finitude of all living things, and especially of humankind itself, forces us to confront the question: does human existence cease completely upon biological death, or is there still a possibility of survival in some form afterward? Throughout the 20th century, this theme held a central place in both analytical and continental philosophy, with notable contributions from philosophers such as Fred Feldman and Martin Heidegger. In contrast to the tendency to avoid or deny death in popular culture, many thinkers have criticized this complacent and unauthentic attitude, viewing the confrontation of death as an indispensable condition for a correct understanding of life.
However, the core question remains: what is death really? Is humanity completely annihilated upon death, or is there a possibility of existence after death? And can religious conceptions of the afterlife withstand philosophical analysis? This video addresses these issues in 10 parts.
Part 1. The issue of life after death in the history of human thought. From the moment humans developed self-awareness, death has been one of the greatest, most enduring, and most haunting questions in human thought. No major civilization has failed to ask: does human existence cease completely with the disintegration of the body? Or is there another form of existence that continues after death? This question, in its various forms, is the foundation of the concept of life after death, afterlife. However, a common misconception is that afterlife is merely a matter of religious belief. In reality, it is a core philosophical issue, directly related to the most fundamental questions. What is a human being? What is the nature of consciousness? How is individual identity constructed? And what, if anything, allows a person to remain themselves over time, even after the physical body has ceased to exist? In philosophy, the question of afterlife is inseparable from 3 central fields: metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and ethics. Metaphysics questions the structure of reality. Are there non-material entities? Philosophy of mind explores the relationship between consciousness and the body. Can the mind exist independently of the brain? Meanwhile, ethics is concerned with the meaning of human behavior if death is not the end.
From prehistoric burial rituals and ancient Egyptian texts to the philosophical systems of Greece, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, the notion of an afterlife has always appeared in various forms. But philosophy does not stop at describing beliefs. It questions the rationality, consistency, and logical possibility of those beliefs. It is here that the afterlife becomes a rigorous philosophical problem. If there is life after death, what lives on? The body clearly decomposes, so what is the soul? Is it an independent entity or merely a function of the body? And if there is life after death, how can we ensure that the subject existing afterward is truly the same person as the one who lived before death? These questions are not merely abstract. They shape how humanity understands itself, its moral responsibility, justice, and the meaning of finite life. Therefore, the afterlife is not a marginal question, but one of the central issues in the entire history of human thought.
Part 2. Soul and Body, the Philosophical Foundation of Belief in Afterlife. Any serious discussion of life after death must begin with a more fundamental question. What is man made of? If man is merely a complex physical body, then when that body ceases to function, existence ends. But if man includes a non-material component, often called the soul or mind, then the possibility of existence after death becomes meaningful. In the history of Western philosophy, dualism has played a central role in shaping the concept of afterlife. According to dualism, man consists of two distinct entities, a physical body and a non-material soul. This distinction opens up the possibility that the soul could exist independently of the body, and therefore could continue to exist after the body dies. Plato was one of the first philosophers to clearly articulate this concept. In dialogues such as Phaedo, he argued that the soul is an immortal entity, its nature closely connected to the world of eternal and immutable forms. The body, on the other hand, belongs to the material world, is constantly changing, and ultimately decays. Death, according to Plato, is not the destruction of the soul, but the liberation of the soul from the bondage of the body.
Plato's view is strongly metaphysical and has had a profound influence, especially on later Christianity. However, it also raises many philosophical questions. If the soul exists independently of the body, what is the relationship between these two entities? How can an immaterial entity interact with a material entity? Aristotle, a student of Plato, offered a more nuanced approach. He did not accept dualism in the sense of complete separation. According to Aristotle, the soul is the form of the body, the organizing principle that makes a living body a living organism, rather than just inanimate matter. The soul is not an independently existing thing, but rather a function and structure of a living body. This understanding complicates the issue of afterlife. If the soul exists only as the form of the body, then when the body ceases to exist, can the soul exist independently? Aristotle leaves some possibilities open, particularly concerning the intellect, nous, but overall his view makes belief in life after death less clear than Plato's.
In the modern era, René Descartes reaffirmed dualism in a new form. He distinguished between res extensa, matter expanding in space, and res cogitans, thinking entity.
According to Descartes, the mind or soul is of a completely different nature from the body, and in principle can exist without a body. This view strongly reinforces the philosophical possibility of the afterlife, but also leads to the famous question, how can two entities of completely different natures interact? The debates surrounding the soul and the body show that the afterlife cannot be considered in isolation from the philosophy of human nature. Each conception of the soul entails a different understanding of life after death, from a clear continuation of the individual to vague or even improbable forms of existence.
Part 3. Christianity and the formation of the theory of life after death. If Greek philosophy laid the conceptual foundation for afterlife, Christianity is the system of thought that transformed it into a complete doctrine, profoundly influencing Western civilization. In Christianity, belief in life after death is not only metaphysical, but also closely linked to ethics, justice, and the meaning of life. According to Christian tradition, humans not only possess an immortal soul, but are also promised a physical resurrection. This represents a significant difference from pure Platonism. Life after death is not merely the soul existing in a non-material state, but a complete human existence, albeit in a transformed form. However, it is here that philosophical problems arise. If the body completely decomposes after death, how does the resurrection occur? Is the resurrected body the same physical body, or merely a new one? And what guarantees that the resurrected person is the same individual who lived before? Christian theologians and philosophers, such as Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, attempted to reconcile Greek philosophy with Christian doctrine. Aquinas, deeply influenced by Aristotle, argued that the soul is a form of the body, but at the same time capable of temporarily existing independently of the body after death. Resurrection, according to him, is the complete reunion of soul and body, restoring the wholeness of human nature. From a philosophical perspective, the Christian doctrine of the afterlife aimed to address two requirements: maintaining individual identity and ensuring moral justice. Without life after death, many injustices in earthly life would never be resolved. Afterlife, therefore, becomes the foundation for the notion of final judgment and ultimate justice. However, critics argue that relying on the afterlife to ensure morality may undermine the intrinsic moral value of the act. This is a debate that will continue to unfold as modern philosophy and materialism re-examine the entire question of life after death. Part 4. Materialism and the greatest challenge to life after death. Entering the modern era, traditional belief in life after death faces an unprecedented challenge: materialism. Unlike previous criticisms of religion or ethics, materialism directly attacks the metaphysical foundation of the afterlife. If humans are merely complex physical systems, then there is no room for an immaterial entity to live on after the body dies. According to materialism, all psychological phenomena, from sensation, memory, consciousness to personality, are products of physical processes in the brain. The mind is not an independent entity, but a function of the nervous system. When the brain ceases to function, psychological phenomena also cease. From this perspective, afterlife is not only unproven, but also ontologically impossible. This position holds strong appeal in the context of modern science. Advances in neuroscience have shown a close link between brain state and state of consciousness. Brain damage can alter personality, memory, and even self-perception. This seems to reinforce the view that the so-called soul cannot exist independently of the brain.
However, from a philosophical perspective, materialism is not simply an obvious conclusion. It raises a deeper question. If afterlife is impossible, how is individual identity understood? And do material criteria truly adequately explain what makes a person remain themselves over time? One of the strongest materialist arguments against the afterlife is the argument for the complete dependence of the mind on the brain. If every state of mind corresponds to a state of the brain, then there is no reason to believe that the mind can exist after the brain has disintegrated. After death, there is no longer a physical basis to sustain consciousness or memory. However, a philosophical counterargument arises at this point. Proving that the mind is dependent on the brain does not mean proving that the mind is identical to the brain. A computer program depends on hardware, but is not identical to the hardware. When the hardware fails, the program doesn't run, but that doesn't say what the ultimate nature of the program is. Of course, this comparison doesn't prove the afterlife, but it shows that the materialist argument isn't entirely closed.
The issue becomes more complex when we consider well-known philosophical scenarios used to challenge intuition about the afterlife. One of these is the reconstruction hypothesis. Suppose all the physical information about a person's brain is perfectly recorded and recreated in another body. Is that recreated individual the same person or just a copy? From a materialistic point of view, if every psychological characteristic is accurately recreated, then there is no meaningful difference between the original and the copy. But our intuitions often resist this conclusion. We tend to think that the copy, however psychologically identical, is still not me. It is here that the afterlife problem shifts from the question of yes or no to the deeper question, what constitutes individual identity?
Some materialist philosophers accept the conclusion that individual identity has no profound essence beyond psychological continuity. If so, afterlife can only exist as a psychological continuation. Memory, personality, tendencies, rather than the existence of a soul in the traditional sense. But this view makes the concept of afterlife very different from the classical religious understanding. From this, it can be seen that materialism not only denies afterlife, but also redefines humanity. It forces us to accept that death is the complete cessation of the subject, and any hope for personal continuation is merely a psychological illusion or an unfulfilled moral need. Part 5. Personal Identity After Death. Who is the one who lives on? If there is one point at which all discussions of afterlife converge, it is the question of personal identity. Even if we assume that some form of existence continues after death, the crucial question remains: is the subject who exists afterward truly the same person who lived before? Philosophy does not accept ambiguous answers. For afterlife to have meaning, there must be a clear criterion for personal identification through death. Otherwise, the notion of "I will continue to exist" becomes empty, because the person who exists afterward may simply be another entity that coincidentally resembles me. One of the earliest approaches is memory theory, often associated with John Locke. According to Locke, a person at a later point in time is the same person as a person at an earlier point in time if and only if the later person can remember the experiences of the earlier person. Personal identity in this way is linked to the continuity of consciousness, not the continuity of the body.
Memory theory seems to align with many everyday intuitions. We often identify ourselves with a stream of memories that stretches across time. However, when applied to the afterlife, this theory encounters serious problems. Human memory is inherently imperfect and frequently interrupted. If a person loses their memory, are they still the same person? And if memories in the afterlife are altered or incomplete, does personal identity become fragmented? Furthermore, the theory of memory faces the problem of circularity. To remember an experience as if it were one's own, one would seemingly have to be the same person. Therefore, memory cannot be both a criterion for defining identity and dependent on identity. Another approach is the theory of psychological continuity. According to this view, individual identity does not depend on a single element like memory, but on a network of interconnected psychological states in a causal manner: memory, beliefs, desires, personality. As long as there is sufficient continuity in this network, we can say that identity is preserved.
The theory of psychological continuity is more flexible and better adapted to afterlife scenarios. However, it also leads to difficult-to-accept consequences. If two different entities share the same psychological continuity with a deceased person, then both could be considered the same person. This breaks the intuitive principle that a person cannot identify with two different individuals simultaneously. Conversely, some philosophers return to the theory of bodily identification. According to this view,
A person at a later point in time is only the same person as a person at an earlier point in time if they share the same body. This approach seems to exclude afterlife from the outset, unless it accepts bodily resurrection in a very strong sense. However, even the theory of the oneness of the body doesn't solve all the problems. The human body changes constantly over time, and no single mass of matter remains constant from birth to death. If the change of matter doesn't cause the loss of identity in earthly life, why does it necessarily cause the loss of identity in the afterlife?
From this, some philosophers arrive at the controversial conclusion: perhaps the very concept of individual identity that we use is unsuitable for application to the afterlife. If so, belief in life after death isn't wrong because of a lack of evidence, but because it requires a kind of personal identity that philosophy cannot provide. This perspective is particularly similar to some Eastern philosophical traditions, where the self is seen as a conventional construct rather than an immutable entity. In that context, afterlife is not the continuation of a fixed individual, but the continuation of a process, a stream of existence without an unchanging center. At this point, it can be seen that the issue of afterlife is no longer a simple religious question, but a comprehensive philosophical challenge to our understanding of humanity. Materialism forces us to confront the possibility that death is an absolute end. Meanwhile, theories of individual identity suggest that even if there is a form of existence after death, the preservation of the self is not self-evident.
Part 6. Near-Death Experiences Between Science and Metaphysics. In modern debates about life after death, few topics are as controversial as near-death experiences, or NDEs. These are subjective reports from people who were in a critical state. Their hearts stopped beating. Their brains were severely deprived of oxygen, but then recovered and recounted extraordinary experiences that occurred in the moments leading up to death. NDE descriptions share striking similarities across different cultures. Experiencers often describe feelings of detachment from their bodies, observing their own bodies from the outside, moving through a tunnel, encountering bright lights, profound feelings of peace, or encountering entities interpreted within familiar cultural and religious contexts. After the experience, many people reported a profound change in their outlook on life, becoming less afraid of death and more inclined to live virtuous lives.
Philosophically, NDEs pose a direct challenge to materialism. If consciousness is entirely dependent on brain activity, how can complex and consistent experiences occur under conditions of severe brain impairment? Some view NDEs as empirical evidence for the existence of consciousness independent of the body, thereby reinforcing belief in the afterlife. However, modern science approaches NDEs with extreme caution. Neuroscientists have put forward numerous hypotheses to explain this phenomenon without resorting to the existence of the soul. Brain hypoxia, the release of neurotransmitters, abnormal temporal lobe activity, or extreme survival responses of the brain can all produce powerful and vivid experiences. In this context, NDEs are seen as products of the brain under extreme stress rather than evidence of a metaphysical reality. Philosophy, caught between these two positions, is forced to ask a more nuanced question. Even if NDEs could be explained by biological mechanisms, does that completely refute the possibility of afterlife? An experience can have a biological cause yet still reflect a deeper reality, just as visual experiences have a physiological basis but still allow us to access the external world. However, this argument also has limitations. Subjective experiences, however powerful, cannot automatically be considered evidence for the objective existence of what is experienced. Cognitive philosophy has shown that humans are capable of creating extremely vivid experiences without corresponding objects in reality. Therefore, NDEs cannot serve as decisive evidence for afterlife. The more important aspect of NDEs from a philosophical perspective lies in their revelation of the complex relationship between consciousness, the body, and the meaning of life. However interpreted, these experiences demonstrate that death is not merely a biological event, but a profound existential event capable of restructuring the entire way humans understand themselves and life. NDEs, therefore, do not definitively resolve the question of afterlife, but they force both science and philosophy to acknowledge that our current understanding of consciousness remains limited. It is within these ambiguities that debates about life after death continue persistently and remain unresolved.
Part 7. Buddhism and Eastern Philosophy. Afterlife has no immutant soul. When Western debates about the afterlife are juxtaposed with Eastern philosophy, particularly Buddhism, a profound contrast emerges. While Western tradition often bases the afterlife on the immortality of the soul and individual identity, Buddhism begins from a completely different premise: non-self. According to Buddhism, there is no unchanging, independent, and eternal self. Human beings are a composite of aggregates: body, feelings, perceptions, actions, and consciousness, constantly changing from moment to moment. Therefore, the question who lives on after death is re-examined from the outset. Without a fixed self, the afterlife cannot be a continuation of a soul in the Western sense. However, Buddhism does not completely deny the continuity after death. Instead, it offers the concept of rebirth based on karma and the stream of consciousness. What is continued is not an immutable self, but a causal process, a continuous stream of conditions in which the subsequent state arises from the previous one. From a philosophical perspective, this concept resolves several dilemmas faced by Western doctrines.
It avoids the question of absolute individual identity by not asserting the existence of an immutable subject that needs to be preserved. At the same time, it maintains the ethical significance of action. What an individual does in this life affects subsequent states of existence. Compared to the continuum of thought in Western philosophy, Buddhism shares a remarkable similarity. Both view identity as a network of causally interconnected states rather than a fixed entity. However, Buddhism goes further by radically abandoning the notion of a central subject. This leads to a different understanding of the afterlife. Instead of asking, "Am I going to live on?" the question becomes, "How will this process continue?" This framing of the issue weakens the obsession with personal death, but at the same time challenges the common human intuition about self.
From a comparative perspective, it can be said that Western philosophy focuses on preserving individual identity, while Buddhism focuses on liberation from attachment to that identity. If the West worries that without an afterlife morality will collapse, Buddhism argues that it is the attachment to the self that is the source of suffering. It is noteworthy that contemporary dialogues between Western philosophy and Buddhism are increasing, particularly in the context of consciousness studies. Some philosophers argue that the concept of non-self can provide a new conceptual framework for understanding consciousness without assuming an immortal soul, while also avoiding falling entirely into simplistic materialism. In this context, afterlife is no longer a question of yes or no, but rather a question of how we understand the continuity of experience and moral responsibility in an impermanent world. Through near-death experiences and Eastern philosophy, the issue of afterlife is expanded beyond the boundaries of traditional Western debates. Instead of seeking definitive proof, philosophy is forced to confront the diversity of how humans experience, interpret, and assign meaning to death.
Part 8. Afterlife and Ethics, Justice, Meaning, and the Value of Life. One of the reasons why belief in life after death has endured for millennia lies not in metaphysics, but in ethics. Even as philosophical arguments about the soul or individual identity remain controversial, afterlife continues to play a central role because it answers, or at least alleviates, a deep-seated moral anxieties. Is life fair? In everyday life, people witness countless injustices that are never rectified. Good people may suffer, bad people may live in prosperity and die peacefully. If death is the absolute end, then many injustices seem to become permanent. Afterlife, in this context, is seen as a mechanism of ultimate justice, where every act is judged and rewarded fairly.
This perspective is particularly evident in monotheistic religions, such as Christianity and Islam, where the afterlife is linked to the final judgment. Earthly morality is no longer an endless game. It has consequences that transcend death. Living a good life has not only social significance, but also eternal significance. However,
Modern ethical philosophy has seriously questioned this understanding. Immanuel Kant, for example, argued that true morality cannot be based on reward or punishment. If a person acts morally only because they hope for reward in the afterlife or fear punishment, then that action no longer possesses pure moral value. From this perspective, the afterlife can undermine the foundation of morality, transforming it into a form of self-interest that extends into the afterlife. On the other hand, if the afterlife were completely eliminated, would morality still stand? Some thinkers argue that without punishment or reward after death, people would lose the motivation to live responsibly. But this argument is also strongly countered. Morality, according to many secular philosophers, does not need an afterlife to exist. It can be built on a foundation of empathy, reason, and responsibility towards people living here and now.
However, the issue is not simply yes or no to afterlife. The deeper issue is afterlife changes how people understand the meaning of finite life. If life only lasts a few decades, each choice carries a different weight than when it is placed in an eternal context. Afterlife expands the horizon of time, causing values such as sacrifice, patience, and justice to transcend immediate gain. Some existentialist philosophers, such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, take the opposite approach. They argue that it is precisely because there is no afterlife that life becomes urgent and meaningful. Without a second chance, without a compensatory world, every action is decisive. From this perspective, afterlife can diminish the existential weight of earthly life. Therefore, afterlife is not the sole foundation of ethics, but it is a powerful interpretive framework for how humans understand justice and meaning. Even when questioned metaphysically, it continues to live on in ethics as a hypothesis that shapes behavior.
Part 9. Modern Science and the Ultimate Limits of Knowledge. If philosophy questions the afterlife, modern science sets the boundaries for what answers are acceptable. Over the past few centuries, science has made enormous strides in explaining the natural world, including the human body and brain. This has led to an implicit expectation. If afterlife exists, science will eventually discover it. However, science operates on certain methods and assumptions. It studies observable, measurable, and repeatable phenomena. Afterlife, if it exists, seems to lie outside this scope. No experiment can directly verify a form of existence after death in a personal sense.
In the study of consciousness, science has made significant progress, but it has also revealed clear limitations. While it can identify brain regions involved in subjective experience, science has yet to explain why physical processes are accompanied by subjective sensations, the so-called dilemma of consciousness. This gap is often cited by some to defend the possibility of consciousness existing independently of the brain. However, from a philosophical perspective, the existence of an explanatory gap does not equate to the existence of an afterlife. The history of science shows that many gaps have been filled over time without the need for metaphysical hypotheses. Therefore, using the current limitations of science to assert the existence of an afterlife is an illegitimate logical leap.
Conversely, science cannot prove that afterlife is impossible. The lack of evidence does not equate to proof of non-existence. This is a crucial point, often overlooked in public debate. Science, by its very nature, maintains a methodical, agnostic attitude toward afterlife. Some attempts to connect afterlife to modern physics, such as through quantum mechanics, often fall into pseudoscience. While quantum physics raises profound questions about the nature of reality, direct inferences from it to the existence of souls or the afterlife often lack serious basis. More importantly, it is important to recognize that while afterlife may be a question beyond science's capacity to verify, it is not meaningless. There are questions about meaning, value, and purpose that science was not designed to answer. Afterlife may belong to this group.
Part 10. Philosophical Conclusion. What does afterlife say about human beings? After exploring metaphysical, ethical, scientific, and comparative Eastern-Western debates, one thing becomes clear. Afterlife is not a single hypothesis that can be proven or disproven by a single decisive argument. It is a convergence point of many ways humans think about themselves and the world. Philosophy suggests that every understanding of afterlife reflects a deeper conception of humanity. Believing in the immortality of the soul is believing in an individual essence that transcends all material change. Denying afterlife is often accompanied by viewing humans as finite entities, bound to the body and time. Eastern philosophies, particularly Buddhism, invite people to let go of the question of who lives on and instead focus on the process and ethical consequences of their actions.
Therefore, the afterlife can be seen as a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest anxieties, the fear of nihilism, the yearning for justice, the desire for meaning, and the need for continuation. Even if the afterlife doesn't exist in the traditional religious sense, the fact that humans constantly contemplate it shows that death cannot be reduced to a mere biological event. Philosophy doesn't offer a certain comfort, but it does provide clarity. It shows that the question of the afterlife is inseparable from the question of how to live. Whether one believes in life after death or not, one must still decide the value of one's actions in this finite life. Ultimately, the afterlife may not be a promise of another world, but rather an intellectual and moral challenge within this world itself. It forces humanity to confront the limits of knowledge, death, and the responsibility to live in such a way that life, whether finite or not, remains worth living.